Well, Philippa, a warm welcome to our event today. We're really pleased that you're coming and doing some of this introductory work um, around the book with us here at Online Events. Thank you. And we're going to spend a bit of time in dialogue together and in conversation. And I think we wanted to begin by you saying something about yourself in terms of as a practitioner, and something of your own personal journey around trauma as well. Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. And just to say, maybe in terms of the format of what we're doing, as you said, John, that the first, how you and I have thought about this is that trauma, as I'll explain in my own journey of writing what I've written, is quite a disturbing thing. It rather like the bottle of water here, things come up. So in the first half, as we speak, about trauma and what happens to us, what symptoms can come. We may feel a little triggered ourselves. And if so, just to say to people to take care of yourself. If you need some space to go and regulate, come back. There'll be plenty of regulation and ideas for that in the second half, if you like to bring the water down again. So I'm a trauma therapist. I've been working in the field for nearly 30 years. I work with individuals and couples. I trained at the Metanoia Institute, and I've also trained in sensory motor psychotherapy, which I refer to quite a bit in the book. Why did I write a book about trauma? I got interested in trauma. I've always been interested in trauma, but I got particularly interested around 2007 when I was working with some GPs who were working with asylum seekers and refugees in Kent, and they weren't psychologically trained. And when they were sitting with people who were traumatized, come on terrible journeys, they found they were feeling very aroused and distressed. So I did some study then about secondary trauma, and I wrote a paper about that, how we pick up trauma from each other, which is very relevant for psychotherapists and counsellors. But my deep thinking about trauma and this book started in the first lockdown, when many of us were separated from each other, and many people were felt overwhelmed and were questioning their lives. And as this kind of unknown threat of the pandemic, which is what it was at the beginning, certainly, came nearer and nearer to us, I noticed that people responded in a variety of different ways. So I thought it seemed sensible to me to write about trauma responses. I wrote a short paper going beyond fight and flight, just laying out many of the many ways we respond. And then after that, after the article, it seemed as though I almost didn't have a choice, that each of those responses, and that ended up to be 20, became a chapter, and I was taken over by something bigger than me, really. I almost didn't have a choice in writing it, and it took 4 years, and now it's coming out in November. But my balance was always to say what the 20 things are, to break trauma down, make it something complex, straightforward and accessible, but also to give mitigations, to give ways in which we can work through trauma and build resilience. So it's both the symptoms and then the help in hopefully equal measure.
What a project, Philippa. Massive. It's really, really massive. And
yeah,
whether you might say a bit more about kind of unpacking trauma in our culture in terms of, I guess we were through the lockdown, there was just so much going on, I guess, in the media, and we're also in a very intense time historically now,
Yeah,
in terms of what's going on around the world. And could you
yeah,
unpack kind of that a little bit for us? And
sure. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I kind of noticed, especially, I don't know if it's because I'm writing a book on trauma, but trauma seems to be, the word trauma seems to be mentioned all the time. If you don't, news reports, things that referred to as traumatic, even if you're at the cheese counter of a supermarket, you hear the word. And I suppose my passion is that I don't think trauma is big and vague. And I also don't believe it should be used as a kind of hold all for everything. It makes real sense to me to break trauma down to bite-sized chunks, not only in understanding, but also as practitioners, so that we can spot it. It's almost like untangling a ball of string into separate strands. So the project developed really as a 20-point tour of trauma of the body and the mind. And you might say to me, why 20? Well, it kind of ended up 20, but going beyond fight and flight to discover what I call where trauma's tentacles end up, 18 other places beyond fight and flight. So, and then one size doesn't fit all. How do we find ways out through is also much, is varied. So it's a workbook because there are exercises, there are stories. The stories are all taken from real life, the composites mostly from client work. Questions for reflection, which are at the end of each chapter. Meditations, breaking free pointers, which are just summary ideas, and a poem. And the poem is an interesting thing. It's a way that I found at the end of a session. Louis MacNeice, the poet, refers to a splash of words in passing. And the poem is a splash of words in passing. It's an attempt to distill some dilemma that the client has in very few words. And I offer a poem at the end of each chapter, each trauma symptom, as a kind of summary. And it's a different level of consciousness, I suppose. Not everybody likes poetry, but it's more about changing the level of consciousness from intellectual understanding to a mindful approach. And mindfulness is a really important way of noticing both the body and the mind, of using the mind to notice the body. And I talk a lot about the body because trauma is held in the body. We are embodied species. I'll come back to this in a minute, but that's just more about the unpacking, untangling the tangled ball of string and laying out different strands carefully. That's the idea.
thank you, Philippa. Thank you. Yeah, and looking forward to coming back to some of those poems.
Yeah.
Maybe one of those stories later on. So yeah, looking forward to that. But coming back to that, like what trauma actually means, as you're saying, it's used very broadly in our culture, and just like when you're referring to trauma, when you're working with clients, like how would you, what what do you mean when you use that word trauma?
Yeah. Well, my mother, who is 88, She doesn't mince her words. She heard about my book and she said, you have to tell people what it means. And of course, it's totally right. We do need to be really clear. So trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, and pain, of course, is bound up with trauma, as it would be with a physical wound. But unlike a physical wound, psychological wounds are often hidden inside us, so therefore not so easy to spot. In fact, the original title for the book, which the publishers didn't want, was Trauma, an Inside Job or an Inside Story. But I wanted the word inside. The other thing to say is what it means. Carolyn Spring, who some of you might know, who's a trauma specialist who does a lot of wonderful work and a leader in the field, she's recently been posting on social media that trauma is suffering that needs a solution. Quite like that, except that I think that it's not just solution. We also need to learn to bear trauma, because trauma can be something that's, as a wound, very hard for us to bear. Another way of putting something around definition is to say that trauma is too much experience. So when something happens to us that's too much for us, we respond, and the charge of that response comes from the bottom up, from the bottom of our spine up. I sometimes think of it like a whoosh. Up the bottom of our spine into our autonomic nervous system, into our brains. It's like, then it can remain unresolved. Going back to my bottle, it's like a fizz in the bottle that wants to escape, but it can't be quite released. If we have an overwhelming or difficult experience and we do release the charge, we don't have trauma. There's no lasting trauma. We've just had a bad experience. But sometimes we don't get chance to process our trauma, and then our pipes, if you think of ourselves as kind of central heating system, the pipes get clogged up. And we have that unresolved post-experience somehow inside our bodies and minds. Peter Levine, who some of you may have come across, his definition, which he's very generously allowed me to put in my book: a highly activated, incomplete biological response frozen in time. Highly activated, incomplete biological response frozen in time.
Well, I think that's the bit that then takes us away from maybe that generalized use of the word, that not everything causes trauma. So could you give us an example of how that might work?
Yeah, I really like this question because as I've just said, and it's really important to be precise, not all bad experiences cause trauma. We can have a terrible incident, feel strong feelings about it, respond to it, talk about it, deal with it, then the intense feelings fade, no lasting trauma. But then the opposite is true. And this is the hidden bit often. We can be traumatized without even knowing it. So two main things. We can have trauma as a result of a one-off shock, like an accident or an assault or a sudden loss, when everything changes in a moment. And this we call incident trauma, one-off traumas. And I recently read a book that a friend recommended to me. I've got it here, because it's very good. Margaret Forster's Over, about parents who lose a child, and the two parents respond from completely different trauma symptoms. But what I was going to say about the book is that how she punctuates the text is before, afterwards. Before, the whole world changed and the rug was pulled out from under their feet. And afterwards, and that's incident trauma. Nothing's the same again. We sometimes call that big T trauma. Small T trauma, that does not mean that they're less than, to be very clear, the big T and the small t is not about one being more severe than the other. But small T trauma is the drip or cumulative trauma that can be so subtle that we don't even spot it. So we can be traumatized if we live in an ongoing, unsafe or uncertain world. Cumulative trauma can also happen if we're dismissed, diminished, or disregarded, or if we're not loved properly for who we are. And when our trauma is developmental, happens when we're not fully formed, as so many of our clients' traumas are, very, very powerful feelings, of course, are involved. And these trauma wounds, of course, impact how our clients, and if we're traumatized, how we respond in our adult lives. So an example, a friend of mine lost his mum when he was 2. Then he had a stepmom who didn't love him properly, and then got rid of his clothes when he went on a gap year, put them in plastic bags, took them to the charity shop. Trauma, a wound of not being properly cared for, which of course then emerges in that person's life in all kinds of ways. So developmental or cumulative trauma of not having our emotional needs met properly, or having ourselves, if you like, put centrally when we need them to be, leads us to feel profoundly unsafe. We know, don't we, from our studies, that we need to be put centrally as a child to feel safe in the world. From that place, we can learn what the world is. So trauma can be caused by not being taken seriously, or having our needs overshadowed through no fault of anybody. You know, I have a client whose brother had huge needs, and that needy brother, his needs overshadowed the whole family. And my client ended up feeling like a cherry on a cake, you know, completely extra. So that's the 2 kinds of trauma. Trauma doesn't just happen between individuals. Of course, it can be traumatizing to live in a society or an organization that subtly treats you differently because of who you are, your social status, your race, your gender, your disability. These can erode our sense of self profoundly. It's another kind of ongoing trauma. Sometimes I think about the 3 Ds. If we're dismissed, diminished, or disregarded. And interestingly, there's an article in this month's BACP journal highlighting the way, ironically, our own profession hasn't always responded to minorities in an affirming way, re-traumatizing those who already feel marginalized. So, you know, we have a lot to learn and to be aware of. So these effects can sometimes be really hard to spot because they erode our confidence. Think of somebody who's been in a domestic violence abuse situation. For example, Scary Spice, whose book I've just read, Mel B. you might think, why does she spend 10 years as an intelligent woman being treated with in a terrible way of domestic terrorism? But we humans are really keen on surviving. And it's a very important imperative to keep going. And when we're up against it, we find it really hard to let go of our survival defenses. So this is why the 20, I think, are so important to understand what our survival defenses are so often keeping us going after we don't need them anymore. That's the catch.
Yes, things can really live on and last a long, long time. And appreciate you making those references into kind of stories that are really in our culture right now. So just, yeah, feel really important. And there is so much conversation right now about trauma, about how we respond to it, how people who've been in the public eye are responding. And
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And like can you say something about the importance of understanding this well, for us as people, as practitioners?
Yeah, as you say, John, trauma is everywhere at the moment. Why does it matter that we know about it? I think trauma makes us feel very alone. When we're wounded, we naturally have an instinct to withdraw from others and from the world. Think of the song, the Paul Simon song, I am a rock, I'm an island. There are so many people who feel disconnected, like disconnected islands in the world. One of my favorite books from last year was this book by Steve Taylor, who you may or may not know. But what I like is the picture, I don't know if you can see that there, of one person on a little island all by themselves. And there's so many people in the world who feel like disconnected islands. And as such, they feel like blaming themselves. And one of my chapters is on shame. How thinking that we are the fault is one of trauma's solutions, and feel like giving up on life. Sometimes not really wanting to actively not be in life as in want to kill themselves, but wanting to avoid pain that way. I have a chapter on that, flopping down, giving up on life. So I think I have a kind of vocation in a way to communicate this message about disconnection. It can also be heartbreaking. I have another chapter on that. Aloneness can break our hearts. Trauma can break our hearts. And one of the reasons for it is that, as I said, we want to withdraw from the world. An example being Andy Airy. Andy Airy is one of the three dads walking who you may have seen on breakfast telly. They've been all over the media. And Andy Airy is the one I'm in touch with. He's kind of from where I am from in Cumbria. And all three of these three dads walking have lost daughters to suicide. Two of them, unbelievably, in COVID time, in the beginning of the first lockdown. Andy Airy's daughter died a bit before that. But Andy Airy lost his daughter Sophie, who was 28, to suicide. She was a nurse. She took her life just before Christmas in 2018. And when they heard the awful news that her body had been found, they live in a small village, Cumbria. He and his wife, and I'm blown away by this, really, it made a conscious decision not to hide away in their house. which was what the trauma was telling them to do. But somehow or other, they had another instinct that they needed to reach out, and they went outside and they walked in their village and they told their neighbours what had happened to Sophie. Part of it was because they didn't want there to be a stigma about suicide. And then, if, as you may know, if you've followed their story on social media, they've gone on to do many walks, raising awareness for Papyrus, which is a suicide prevention charity. So why I like this story is because it's every cell of Andy's being was telling him to curl up protectively, retreat from pain. But rather than do that, he had another instinct to contact the world, and even though he didn't know what would happen, and trust that something good might come from that. Isn't that a great metaphor? Isn't that a great story of encouragement for ourselves if we've been traumatized and feel like we're alone in the world, and for our clients? Yeah.
Wow. So it's such a touching story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And amazing that they could find a way to reach out like that, resist the disconnection.
Yeah. 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 And
you-
I think this is why I want to write about the 20s, because I want them to be, and for my clients to know that they're human, and it's not true that they're that it's your fault that you have these symptoms. It's simply what trauma does to us.
Yeah, that's so humanizing to have that knowing. And could you say some more to us about these different symptoms, I guess? And yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So some of these trauma responses can be quite dramatic. So chapter 1, which we're going into in this conversation, is more about the water in the bottle being high, the heightened arousal, jumpy, reactive, highly triggered in the red zone, sometimes called the red zone. The red zone being too much arousal. We also can flop down into the blue zone, which is when we go under the radar, which is another chapter, more zoned out. But thinking about the red zone for a minute, Nick Cage, who you may know, singer-songwriter from Australia, lives in the UK now. But when he lost his son, jumped off a cliff, fell off a cliff, he wrote a book called Faith, Hope and Carnage. And he writes so powerfully about his inner screaming, because, and actually Andy Airy, the same, as if there's so much arousal and pain in the body that you don't almost feel that you can carry on from one minute to the next. As I've already said, these very, very intense feelings can fade over time, no lasting trauma. But they can, without the right help and support, go on to develop into PTSD. And there's a story in the book, in chapter 3, which is on triggering, about a man called Joe Yelverton, true story, and he's given his permission for me to talk about him. He's also on the radio, talked about it. He had a avalanche accident, lost his best friend, and he didn't get any help. And he went back to doing more stuff on the slopes. And over 20 years, he suffered from terrible PTSD. So without the proper help and support, these arousal can grow like Topsy. And if you think like a whirlwind that goes more and more, can go out of control. He was, though, very thankfully able to get some help in the end. Joe Yelverton. So those are dramatic kinds of symptoms. Others, though, are much more subtle and hidden inside. I've already referred to some of these. We might feel lost, broken, and empty. One person with a kind of deep developmental attachment trauma described a void inside and an image in his mind of a field with debris all over it. And that's another facet of trauma, is that we can feel literally in pieces with no overall coherence. And I have worked with people with full-blown DID, dissociative identity disorder, where they are at the mercy of one part of themselves, which is, I will come back to that in a minute, but disconnection can lead to serious things of that nature. So just going back to the arousal, the kind of trauma taking us over idea for a minute. I have a kind of belief about this world that we're living in at the moment being extraordinarily reactive. There's almost an epidemic of reactivity in our world, in our national debate, in our polarized politics, in our us and them thinking. We can't have, it's so difficult to have proper debate, my truth versus your truth. And I think that this can lead us to feel, and our clients, profoundly unsafe, especially if they already have a trauma history. Other kinds of symptoms. With the too much, we might end up feeling just very numb and indifferent, cut off from the world, like we don't even care about it, or experiencing the world as if through plate glass. Another response could be that we might feel in a real slump, powerless. I can't do anything. This is very common, and I find it with my clients very frequently, including therapy being no help. So I think that this is a very interesting trauma response, this slump. We could call it the blue zone, underneath the window of tolerance. Daniel Siegel talks about the window of tolerance, that where we feel safe and comfortable in our own skin is the green zone. Talk about that more in a minute. But the blue zone, under the radar, is a fascinating trauma response, and a response to being in an unsafe environment. So what happens is, and actually this is only being fully understood in recent years by Professor Stephen Porges, who some of you may have come across his polyvagal theory. So the slump response is when the parasympathetic nervous system cuts in and our blood pressure goes down, and we might just not be able to do anything at all. It's a physiological response. And if you think about a gazelle in the savannah that's attacked by a lion, you know, it might be able to flee or it might be able to fight, but probably its best bet is just to slump, because the lion could just decide it was only interested in the thrill of the chase and go off to some other gazelle. So it could save its life. And the same thing happens with us as humans. But Stephen Porges was the first one to properly formalize this in terms of science. And it's so important for rape victims who feel ashamed about not fighting their attacker, for example. So all of this is part of this, this disconnect, dropping down under the radar. I can't you know, GPs often talk about patients who they try to help, and they sometimes call them heart sink patients, which isn't very kind. And the reason is because the patient isn't responsive to help. You know, they can't do this, they can't do that. I've had many clients of this kind over the years, but if we can understand it as a trauma symptom with compassion, and the person themselves can understand that this is a trauma symptom, I think that can be quite helpful to work with the I can't, to work with the slump. Other kinds of trauma symptoms are about how we feel about other people, because of course trauma, we traumatize each other. You know, we're supposed to be helping each other together in the world, but often our traumas are because of human to human damage. So we can feel ambivalent towards people. We might need them. Of course, a child who's been damaged developmentally, they need the other person, but they can also fear them. They need the relationship, but then they're conflicted. And I sometimes think about this ambivalent attachment kind of trauma as the push me, pull you. Did you ever see that, Dr. Dolittle? You have to be a certain age to remember Dr. Dolittle, but there was an animal which called the push me, pull you, which had a head at each side, pushing this way and pushing that way. That's just the way I think about ambivalent attachment. So, of course, we come across that in our work with clients, don't we? Where they may want and they may need our help, but also push us away at the same time.
It's great to be able to, well, I think it's so helpful to be thinking about what those different trauma symptoms can be. And I'm sure as we're listening, I can definitely identify some of those things in myself. I'm sure we are as a group, noticing that in ourselves or in the people that we work with, and kind of making that transition to thinking about how we work as practitioners, and whether you might say something for us, Philippa, about how we can spot those symptoms in the people that we're working with and our clients.
Yeah. So basic difference is between the too much and the too little, the red and the blue. So the too much, as we've already said, on edge, jumpy, easily under threat, buzzing, flipping our lids. I also think that metaphors are quite helpful. And these are some of the ones that my clients and I have come up with, like being on a white water raft without being in control of the currents. Like all the fire alarms in the citadel of our bodies and minds are on high alert, and we feel as though anything might happen. So we might notice this fight, flight, arousal if somebody's very manic, and that they are as if on an express train that they can't get off. And of course, it's important to understand the biology of this. And clients like to know about the biology. I've already talked about the volcano, the bottom-up response. But as that whoosh of alarm comes through the limbic brain, it activates the amygdala, which is the brain's smoke detector, which raises the alarm. Then, once this alarm is signaled, the vagus nerve, which is meaning vagabond or wandering, a long cranial nerve that runs down the whole body from the brain to the heart, to the lungs and the digestive system, sends messages to the organs, releasing powerful stress hormones, particularly cortisol, which keeps the amygdala activated and keeps us alerted to danger over time. We might notice increased heart rate, tunnel vision, dilation of pupils, sweating, wobbly knees. if it was in a client in a room with us, we might notice the speed of their speech, their darting eyes, their lack of the ability to have psychological contact with us. And it's also important to say that it's not so easy for somebody who's on that kind of stress ride to change it. Why? Well, because this can be strangely addictive and exhilarating. And it can be the only answer that we know. Because what fear says in the whoosh, we must protect ourselves from more harm. So we became imprisoned by the responses that I describe, and it becomes like a snowball going down the hill. So too little. We might, in the blue zone, feel zoned out, floppy, can't get off the couch, no mojo, no spring in our step, can't trust others, lash out, suspicious of them, horribly alone, freezing, no longer safe, under the radar, like I've already described, disconnected from ourselves. And the physiology here is the parasympathetic nervous system cutting in like this corrective brake. So why might this too much or too little really matter? Well, if we're locked into these responses, we have a problem with our feelings. We're either feeling too many feelings or not enough, to put it in a kind of crude way. A colleague of mine who's trained as a Jungian said that trauma is an injury in our capacity to feel. I think this is so important because feelings ideally are our internal compass. They are, they tell us what we need to do, whether we want to do this or whether we want to do that. And if we don't trust those feelings, because we're bombarded with too many of them or we can't find them, we can't set boundaries. So a quick one on boundaries. When we've lost our capacity to trust our feelings, we might find that our clients find it really difficult to set proper boundaries. And I just thought I'd throw in a metaphor here, that in case it's helpful to folk. It's one that I use with clients quite a bit. And it's a metaphor about, if I can find my little picture here, a castle. So if you think of a castle, like Warwick Castle, actually this one is the Alhambra in Spain. If you can see that, the castle has an outer perimeter and an inner perimeter. And if you imagine that you were patrolling around this castle, you would need to be having soldiers looking out from the outer perimeter, faced outwards, wouldn't you? Because you would need to make sure about who was coming to the castle, who was going to attack, what the danger was. So this facing outwards on the outer perimeter is very, very important. As well as that, we also need some soldiers on the inner perimeter. And this is very frequently what can go wrong with trauma. The inner perimeter, the soldiers need to have themselves facing the other way. Because the vulnerable people are in the middle of the castle. So they need to be keeping an eye on them. So this inner perimeter is very, very important. in trauma. And why I'm laboring that point is that what we've lost in trauma very often is a sense of safety, not just safety in the world, i.e. high alert, what's going to happen next, more trauma, but safety in ourselves, in our own bodies and minds. I was only working with somebody this morning who's profoundly traumatized. We're not going to tell the story of the trauma. Why not? Well, not yet anyway, because the person is already aroused. They're already struggling in life so much. What they need is to develop, to start with, a sense of regulation, inner regulation, coming into the green zone. And the way to do that is to develop their adult functioning to be able to soothe themselves. I'm going to come on to this much more in the second part. But I really like this metaphor of the castle, so that we, yes, watch out for the outside world and what's coming, but we also keep a sense of our inner world and keep asking ourselves what we need, as well as soothing and developing the muscle in our arm of safety. Regulation means the brain, the mind, telling the body that it's safe. And you'd be surprised how much repetition, how much work that takes if we've been traumatized, to mitigate the trauma by bringing safety in. So, you know, a client might come to therapy and think, yes, I can get some therapy for my trauma. I come once a week. No, the work is in between. The work is, yes, being encouraged by the therapist to use their mind to help your mind, but the work is in between, in the safety and in the soothing. I'll say a lot more about that in part two. I don't know whether I've gone off your question there, John. Probably have.
Well, I'm also keeping my eye on the time, because we wanted to make sure that we give everybody a screen break as well. I wonder if, before we go to break, if you could say a little bit more about, like, the kind of hopefulness, the kind of kind of recovery that's possible around the mind and the body. Would that work? The kind of bit we could do?
I think that would be a nice thing just to move into. Yeah, absolutely. So I've already touched on this with the green zone, haven't I? So one thing is regulation central. So the good news is that the effects of trauma can be mitigated. So depending on the severity of the trauma and the existing resources that we have, restoring well-being can take time and various types of help, and one size does not fit all. And we need to be creative about what works with whom. But if we can pause, if we can find things that can enrich our humanity and mitigate trauma's overwhelm, we can do this comparatively quickly. And I'll just name a few things. One thing that I was so thrilled with this week was that I watched a little bit of the Chelsea Flower show. I don't know if anybody did, but they're already getting the idea that we need green gardens. We need to be in green in urban spaces. We need to be having the green to soothe ourselves. So there are all kinds of things. But if we're therapists, of course, we've had probably many experiences of sitting with somebody who's taken over by trauma. But when something is understood and deeply attended to, it's rather like going down a funnel, you know, at the top of the funnel. If you imagine the funnel, there's always liquid going around, swirling. But once we go down the funnel to the point of the distillation, we get to the heart of things. There's a huge relief when we pay attention. And what we know is that this part of the brain, the Hindus call it the third eye, but behind that third eye the part of the brain there, once we enlist that noticing brain, the limbic part of the brain is soothed. So paying attention, noticing what's happening, soothes us very, very quickly. I don't know if any of you have come across Tara Brach. I like her, and many of my clients like her work. She talks about rain. It's been having a lot of rain, haven't we, in our climate? But my clients love this, rain. Recognize what's going on. Allow the experience to be there as it is. Investigate with interest and care. Nurture with self-compassion. Rain. So that's regulation central. Second thing, body central. Now, Bessel van der Kolk, we all, I'm sure, know him, and his amazing Body Keeps the Score. I love that title. So many of my clients love that title. Sometimes his book is quite hard for them, but there's a lot of detail in it. But the title is fantastic. It's so true, because of trauma leading us to respond in such instinctive ways. The body not only holds the trauma, but the body memories of trauma are in our bodies. But the corollary is that the bodies can help us recover too. I mentioned at the beginning that I've been very influenced by Pat Ogden and the work of sensory motor psychotherapy and Ron Kurtz. And they've developed a wonderful neuroscience-informed method that allows paying mindful attention to the body. And then they call doing something called sequencing, where you decouple the emotion and the thought, pay just attention to the body. And then the body, often, if there's a tension in it, knows what to do to heal. As a whole method. I can highly recommend anybody who's interested in it, because I think it's wonderful trauma body-based psychotherapy. So I do quite a lot of that in my work. Just a quick example. There's a whole story I was going to read from the book, but not time for that now. But just very quickly, a client who came to see me said they felt like their skin was crawling. They wanted to get out of their own body. Such an intense arousal at the skin bodily level, terrible tension. What we did was we stayed with that tension. We paid attention to it together. And very quickly what happened, this only happened this week, was the client had an image of a little boy, 6-year-old boy. And this little boy just came into his mind. And as that happened, it was his vulnerable self from long ago, which he neglected and not thought about and not paid attention to. And we were able to talk about that little boy. And then the body tension left. So just a quick example of how the body central can work. And then just the third thing I would say, just before we go to the break, is the use of words. You know, we have been given minds and bodies. And one of the practices that I've already mentioned about with my clients using these words, and also in the distillation of truth, is to really encourage clients to, as they notice their bodies, say there's a little swirling in the chest or they're in the belly, very often the chest or the belly, you might say to the client to describe it, is it still, is it moving, has it got a colour, does it want to speak? If it wants to speak, what might it say? This can be so transformational. Using words, and also encouraging clients to journal in between sessions to get the trauma moving, to get the dissipation of what's got stuck in those pipes. So shall I just read a quick poem to kind of close this half, and then we'll take a little break, John? That'd be good.
I think that'd be lovely. Thank you, Philippa. Yeah.
These was just some words that I wrote about a client's trauma in the last couple of weeks. Locked in tornado, fizzed up, out of control. Something is happening to us and we don't feel on solid ground. Not quite right, but what to do? Going too fast, whipped up, taking risks, fixated. Something has got me in charge, is in charge. Its charge is in charge. Conflicts within and without. Hellish living, if I'm honest. Not liking myself like this. This is all I know how to do. Dare I be honest? Scary to stop. Better keep going. Or can I reach out and take a breath and trust what might happen next?
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you. Very powerful way to bring our first half to an end, or to kind of come to a pause,
Yeah.
I guess. So yeah, I really appreciate all that you're sharing about your own experience as a practitioner and all the thinking that's gone into the book. So thank you for that. Shall we take a bit of a screen break? I think that's also good modeling in terms of what you're saying about regulation, I guess. Coming back into the green zone, if maybe something
Back into the green zone. Yeah.
Yeah, well, welcome back, everyone. It's good to have you back in. And I think as we're kind of getting started on the second part of our time together, I think there were some things you wanted to bring from the first chapter of the book, I guess. Give us a feel of the practical things that the book has for us. Did you have a sense of where you wanted to start on that, Philippa? Or
Well, I wondered if it might be fun to start with a story. So there's one or two stories, trauma stories, as I call them, in the book. And this is one of chapter one. Chapter one is Trauma Takes Us Over. So we're into the red zone. And they're composites drawn from my sitting with traumatized people for many years, but then they're the composites. So the idea is sharing a story about what happens to someone and then what happens afterwards. So shall I start with reading Raphael's story and see where that takes us?
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan, Philippa. Thank you.
Raphael, the war reporter. Raphael has early exposure to danger. He is physically and sexually abused as a young child and later treated cruelly in foster care and in children's homes. As a result, Raphael's young mind and body is wired for threat and has become red zone central. As a teenager, he becomes feral, takes risks and seeks thrills. Through his experiences, he develops an extraordinary ability to master tricky situations, which together with his acute intelligence makes him determined to work his way up from basic print room job to eventually becoming a journalist. Raphael is drawn to reporting on conflict situations, excelling at keeping a clear head and capturing the essence of complicated situations in words. When he moves into broadcast journalism, his 2-minute summaries filmed close to gunfire and shelling are sought after by television companies. Raphael becomes known as an expert and internationally known. He starts to take more risks on each trip. He only feels fully alive when he is in acute danger. Long before this, Raphael fell in love with Maria when they worked in the print room together, and they have now been happily married for many years. She is supportive of his vocation as a journalist, but suffers terribly with worries when he's away. When he returns home, Raphael becomes obsessed. Anything can be the candidate for his next fixation. And then remote, unreachable, and depressed. Raphael is unable to cope with ordinary life. The calmer life is, the more unhappy he is. Being in danger draws him irresistibly. When he survives danger and understands difficult things, he feels a sense of power in doing something useful. And this power inures him to danger. Danger excites and compels him. Feeling a hero at work is intoxicating and intense. There is another aspect at play here for Raphael. Being a success is a ticket out of trauma, very different to his traumatic past when he's utterly helpless, unable to stop terrible things happening to him. Maria realizes that Raphael is seriously out of balance and needs a reboot. She is unsure what to do for the best. Without consulting Raphael, she decides to book a break for them at a spa hotel. She instinctively knows Raphael needs to slow down, but how will he react to her intervention? At first, Raphael strongly resists and tells her flatly he's not going to go to the hotel. She stands up to him, telling him firmly that he's been frenetic and weird and needs space to sort things out. Somewhere Raphael knows this to be true. The determined constancy of his wife's love reminds him of what he most needs to do: calm down. An important point: the reboot is not a magic solution, but a start. It takes several repetitions of this story for Raphael to see and accept his patterns of behavior when trauma takes him over. First, he seeks danger and then becomes enthralled to its fear-fueled obsessions before falling into a collapse. With each repetition, things get worse. This can happen with trauma. At the same time, Raphael needs the repetitions because on each circuit, he sees things more clearly. Awareness of his trauma response is like the slowly focusing of a camera, helping Raphael take himself more seriously and chip away at his compulsive behavior. When he's able to calm down, Raphael can think more objectively about what is happening to him and begin to set appropriate limits. With some psychological help, he comes to recognize his trauma fear as a powerful force compelling him to act. He begins to befriend this force and learn its ways. His employers also start taking his trauma seriously. They refer him for a psychological assessment before they allow him to get on the next plane. For the abused young Raphael, the repeated invasion of his body against his will and the chaos at home sends the stress hormone cortisol surging through his body, leading him to feel constantly and profoundly unsafe. Repeatedly placing himself in dangerous environments paradoxically makes Raphael feel safe because it feels normal. Sexual trauma has disabled Raphael's ability to trust his instincts because he had to accept things that he knew was wrong long ago. His amygdala was lost its capacity for clear messaging and is misfiring all over the place, telling him that profound danger is normal and what he needs. His trauma responses are ruling the roost.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you. Well, and it can be so counterintuitive that, like, trying to get out of trauma and then seeking something that feels very similar when we're so desperate to get out. And but there's a kind of logic there, or there's something that makes sense. Could you say a bit about that? Kind of how kind
Yeah,
of how that works. Yeah.
absolutely. It's of course, this story might feel a little bit like Fergal, what's he called? Keane? Is he one of the war journalists that's written about trauma, who suffered himself from PTSD? It's not him, by the way, but he's one that comes to mind. But I agree, John, that risk-taking is inherent in many traumas, and many trauma stories do have a kind of logic. What do I mean? Well, expression of intensity following a trauma can sometimes be healthy and necessary as an arc that we need to follow. So just think about what needs to come out of the bottle. It's not all about letting the come down into the yellow green zone. Sometimes the red zone needs to come out and be expressed. And there are treatments for trauma that recreate the intensity of the red zone, such as cold water swimming, sweating in a sauna, or pushing ourselves to an edge physically. All these things can help our bodies and minds express and discharge trauma, and then be in the present moment, and then find our equilibrium, if you like, on the other side of that. But of course, we have to be very, very careful, because Raphael has lost a sense of what's safe for him. So we have to be careful with these arcs and do them in bite-sized chunks and with safety around. Does that make sense?
It does. That sounds so important. And like in the story, I guess Raphael's wife is just very important in kind of
Yeah,
understanding and recognizing some of these things. And I think that's where your book is also helpful in terms of, for us as practitioners, our clients, and maybe the people who live with our clients too, understanding
right.
what's going on. And
Yeah,
could you say a little bit more, like if we're living with someone like Raphael, I guess,
yeah,
the kind of things, responses we might have? And,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I think that what I like about Maria, is she called Maria? Yes, Raphael's wife, is that she takes the power that she has. Power can be used for good or ill, can't it, in the world? But I think if we're close to somebody who's suffering with trauma and they're out of kilter, I mean, I like this picture because this picture shows so often what happens in trauma is that we lose our equilibrium, we lose our center. And there are many stories in the book about loving partners, mothers, co-workers who use the power they have to draw alongside and take the clues from the traumatized person. Because that's the other thing, we can easily get it wrong by using logic. Sally Donovan, who wrote a book about adopting children, says that logic is a gun that can backfire on itself. I love that. Because if we just use logic with somebody who's traumatized and fixed in some kind of thing that they're doing rigidly, there's a whole chapter on rigid thinking as well, that gun of logic can backfire, and it just makes somebody dig in more. So empathy is what they need, but also very, very calm attention, unflappable being there, not overdoing the logic too much without the softness of caring. All of that will be very important to use the power that you have with a traumatized person, and also consistency. Taking the cues from them. If you come too close, you might need to back away, ask them what they need, those kinds of things. And if you're part of the support group for such a person, community matters, organising rotas if somebody's just had a terrible disaster, to help them attend to the different needs that they have, like outer perimeters around a central. There's the trauma in the middle, and then there's the outer perimeters of care.
Mm-hmm.
So other things that help us to regulate, breathing. Breathing is an antidote to too much of trauma. We breathe all the time, but sometimes trauma takes our breathing over our breathing and makes it very shallow and fast. Our focus is too narrow. Also, our bodies constrict. So to counteract that, we breathe from our abdomen, we open our chests, we lengthen our spine, we expand like a concertina. And this gives us space to notice the view. And we calm down. So that's the breathing, empathy and connection. Very often people say, why do they behave like that? Even that has a slight judgment attached to it. I think we should ask a question of what has happened to the person. What has happened? There'll be a set of experiences. And imagining that the traumatized person probably something has happened to them that's outside their experience, is too much for them, might be outside our experience too. So using our imaginations as well. All of this will help them find a sense of safety inside. First port of call of any trauma treatment is safety inside. We can also teach our clients self-soothing. I've got a couple of breathing exercises which I could offer. We could even do it together. Do you fancy that, John?
I think that would be great. I think that would be really good.
Okay.
Well, I think that would be perfect for us here in the event, because I guess we're touching lots of things in ourselves, and something that we could learn for the people around us, for our clients. So yes, please, Philippa.
Perfect. So taking a breathing space. So 2 simple breathing practices which I offer clients. First of all, let's make our postures supported. So make sure our backs are supported by the chair, our feet are firmly planted on the floor. And go inside. What I mean by that is become aware inside, focusing our minds on our bodies, and particularly on our breath. And as we do that, just very gently paying attention to the rhythm of our breath in and out. Noticing the sensations around that. And just if it feels natural, begin a gentle count on the in-breath. 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then slightly lengthening the out-breath to 9 if you can. The numbers don't matter. It's more about making the out breath slightly longer. Sometimes we can push that last out breath a little bit further than we normally would. And when you get to your bottom of your out breath, just try pausing for a couple of seconds before the in breath. Just notice what that feels like. And as we're in this mindful state, I'm going to move on to a second breathing practice, which clients quite like as well, which is the child's slide. So we've all been probably seeing what a child's slide looks like in a playground. So going back to the mindful state, going up the steps, taking in little sips of breath. 1 step in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the top of the in-breath and little sips, and then a long slide out breath. Down the slide and right to the long bit at the bottom, further than you normally would. And then going back to the in-breath, little steps. Till you're full to the top. And then out breath. It's fine to push it a bit as well. Sending it right to that end. I'm just leaving a pause there for you to try that without my instruction. How are you doing with that, John? I can only see you, so I was watching your breathing there. Hope I was getting it in line.
Lovely, yes. It takes the body into quite a different space, and I just wonder if anybody else might want to type something in the chat. You don't have to. We don't want to pull you out of something, but yeah, if you want to let us know how you are, how you're doing. Yeah. Comment there, very relaxing. So thank you for that. That was definitely the experience I was having. Yeah. I love breath work, immediate impact, free and always with you. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
At
Love
any
the
time
child
it's
slide.
accessible.
Yeah.
Loving the child slide. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, a few comments about really enjoying the child slide.
Oh, that's good.
And that it's a new exercise to help clients, really calming. So yeah, lovely.
Great.
That's great.
Great. I also have a surrender to gravity exercise, which we could do, I guess, but it's more about doing it. You'd need to be lying down or imagining you were lying down. I can talk you through it. It actually should be, though, in the resources. I think that's right, John, is it? I think it's in the resources.
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't need to go to do it now, but it's a lovely one. And if you think about the logic of the gravity exercise, if trauma comes from the body up, it so much makes sense to bring ourselves down, doesn't it? Gravity is our best friend. So, for example, the little poem that goes with the exercise says, surrender to gravity. Gravity is your best friend, always present, always available, always ready to respond. Gravity is holding you, letting you sink and absorbing all your stress. I sometimes do an exercise with clients where when they have so many things that are hard to let go of, so much of our struggle as humans is to let things go, isn't it? That they send the stresses, the worries, the thoughts down a river, imagining that they're on a bridge looking down a river, but the river's quite a fast flowing river. So you're sending it away. And you can also use the breath with that. You can put the gravity, the breath exercise with it. Sending it down the river, using an image in the mind at the same time. I find clients.
Well, we do have a request to do the lying down exercise, and I also think doing that one with the river sounds. We've probably got time for an exercise, and then maybe
a couple of
well, I think you really wanted to see if there was any questions that anybody wanted to bring. But before we kind of go into that zone, what do you think, Philippa?
Yeah. So the request was to do the surrender to gravity.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're in a position to be able to lie on the ground, please do that. If not, imagine that you are. So this is the surrender to gravity exercise. Rest your whole body on the ground with your legs stretched out. If more comfortable, bend your knees with the soles of your feet touching the ground. Find exactly the right way for you. Take a little time to properly arrive in your body for a moment. And adjust your position carefully to make yourself super comfortable. Imagine your body is making an imprint in warm sand. What would it look like? Would there be any differences on one side or the other? As you imagine this, feel the weight of your body sinking lower, really being supported from underneath. Gently roll your head from one side to the other, taking time to stop in the middle. Really feel the weight of your head and your muscles working as you do this. Let your knees fall just a little from side to side. As you do this, really feel the weight of your pelvis and allow your pelvis and glutes to get a little massage from the ground. Surrender to gravity. Gravity is your best friend. Always present. Always available. Always ready to respond. Gravity is holding you, letting you sink and absorbing all your stress. How are you doing there, John?
That was lovely, even sitting up. Yes.
Just think how much better it would be if you were lying down.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. Just
Yeah.
I could really feel what you're saying about that.
The weight.
Like the pulling down, just such a difference to the like trauma is going up and all the drama of going up and just having that pulling down. So yeah.
Clients sometimes are helped by having weighted blankets, which you can get. I'm not quite sure where. I think they are available, but actually feeling that warmth, that weight. Again, it's the same idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought I might just throw in a poem there, which was written for Raphael.
Okay. Yes, please.
So just a very short poem. Frightened, jumping, this way, that way, only knowing my fragmented, terrified, beyond twitchy self, I bump off edges, jarring, jangled, ricocheting, the mercy of life, at the mercy of me, my pinball self. Let me rest.
Thank you, Philippa. Could you read again? Would that be often like the second time poem really lands? Would that feel okay to you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this was for Raphael, the war reporter who couldn't get off his train, as it were. Frightened, jumping, this way, that way, only knowing my fragmented, terrified, beyond twitchy self. I bump off edges, jarring, jangled, ricocheting at the mercy of life, the mercy of me, my pinball self. Let me rest. I long for a kinder way.
Thank you. Thank you for reading again. Yeah.
Sometimes I say to clients that the kind bit is so vital. That trauma symptoms, we can be very hard on ourselves. And so to mitigate that, we need great big dollops of compassion. I like the word dollop. It's like, you know, clotted cream. Great big dollop of compassion. Not so easy to do. Always. But a journey.
It's a lovely metaphor, the dollop of clotted cream. There's nothing mean about that kind of portion of compassion and kindness. And
Yeah.